All right. Awesome. Thanks so much. All right, everyone. So hello. Hi. We are LA Compost. What do we do? In short, we restore the lost connections between soils and souls. So supporting the reconnection of humans and just reconnecting with their soil. We do that through a variety of different ways. One is through compost education and workshops, hence what we're doing today, as well as hands-on learning opportunities through volunteer events. We also do this work through community compost access, which is tied to our compost co-op programs and open community hubs where you can drop off your food scraps and learn more about composting. And then through our regional hubs program, which is connected to our contact-free and farmers market drop-offs. Awesome. Thank you, Gina. So yes, this is our LA Compost Hubs and Partners map. We call this like our human network. And essentially, yeah, it's an abbreviated version and kind of this aerial snapshot of all of the different partners that we have and all of our different sites. Something that I want to acknowledge that's like kind of cool about this slide is I mentioned it's like an aerial snapshot of our partnerships, but you know, at LA Compost, we have this thing where we're always like trying to learn from nature. And so we also have, you know, this analogy of it's also an aerial snapshot of kind of from a distance of what like a soil food web can look like, and just acknowledging like a lot of these things, they don't happen in isolation. So just kind of making that point there. Awesome. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Gina, who will share a little bit more about what we will be talking about and the things that we'll be covering today. Go ahead, Gina.
Awesome. Thank you, Anjali. Yeah, so our kind of rough agenda for this evening, we talked a little bit about LA Compost. We're going to go into why we compost, so sort of big picture. We'll move into Compost 101, so just going over kind of the basics of the composting process. And then we'll move into talking about how you guys can compost in community or at home, so giving some real tools and information to start composting. Hopefully after this workshop, you're ready. And then we'll have some space at the end for a Q&A. So we always start off our presentations by sharing this fact, really to create the stage of why we care about this issue and why it's such a huge issue. So in Los Angeles County, nearly 1 million tons of food scraps, food waste go to landfills annually. So obviously this is a huge number, and this is really what we're working at reducing. And the reason why it's so important that we reduce that is for a number of reasons. And so kind of the first reason is talking about climate change. So that photo that we saw on the last slide of the food scraps, you know, sitting in a plastic bag, when that happens in landfills, that organic material is not able to decompose in a natural way. And so it decomposes anaerobically. Anaerobic decomposition basically creates more methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas. So just by keeping our food out of landfills, we're making a huge impact on the amount of greenhouse gases that are being released into the atmosphere. Another really key reason is that 70% of topsoil globally is depleted. This is a result of soil management over time and maybe lack of soil management over time. And so in areas like Los Angeles, where most of our region has been highly disturbed due to development, we are particularly deficient in microbial life. So not only does this have a huge effect on just agricultural in general and being able to grow food, but it really kind of comes back into our own backyard where this soil is super deficient in microbial life, so compost can help bring it back to life. And then another fact that we always keep in mind is that up to 1 in 4 families in Los Angeles are food insecure. And so when you look at how much food goes to waste and how many folks out there don't know where their next meal is coming from, we just think it's really important to prioritize looking at our food systems, composting our food waste, and that can help to build healthy soils. And it also supports localized and organic food systems so that we can have, urban gardens in Los Angeles and everywhere. So LA Compost diverted 402 tons of food waste in 2021. And one of our community 3 bins, which you guys might have seen, it can divert about 7 tons annually. So this is just kind of a reminder that all of the work that we do, you know, individuals dropping off just a couple pounds of food scraps has a huge impact, and also gives us the realization that we still have a lot of work to do. So the more people that start composting and start contributing really does make a difference.
Awesome. Thanks, Gina. All right, our next section, here we go. What is compost? Compost is a verb and a noun. It is the finished product of decomposed material, as well as the process of decomposing organic matter. When I talk about compost, I always make the point that compost is not soil. It's a part of soil and soil food web and healthy soil systems, but just wanted to clarify that it is not soil. It is a soil amendment, and just kind of more a part of like the soil food web. Awesome. Compost 101, it is microbe facilitated decomposition. What does that really mean? Composting is essentially the process of microbes metabolizing and transforming organic matter into humus, aka decomposition. Gina and I, we were talking about this earlier, just in the form of like wanting to give more clear examples. And going back to what I said earlier of like how LA Compost, we're always doing our best to learn from nature. But essentially, we at our compost sites, we're creating the right conditions and like biomimicking to create the environment for these microbes to be able to have the space so that they can metabolize and just kind of do their thing, which is decompose, right? The right conditions make for the right results. Something else we always say at LA Compost is anything that was once alive can be composted in the right conditions. So just understanding the importance of having a very healthy, balanced pile is going to make for just a much more smooth compost experience for anyone. And when you ensure an ideal balance of the key elements, composting, the compost process is most it can be quick, it can be like minimal odors, and it can be cleanly. So yeah, we're here to share like more tips about how you guys can have a more smooth running system, composting system. Great. And then as far as the types of composting methods that LA Compost focuses on at the sites where we're composting are 2 types, which is thermophilic and vermicomposting. Thermophilic meaning hot composting, vermicomposting meaning composting with worms. And yeah, something I always want to acknowledge is there are many different forms of composting and many different types. Many indigenous communities have been using different forms of composting methods. I mean, for a very long time, even if it's just digging a hole and putting your food scraps there and allowing for the decomposition process to happen independently. But these are the core 2 that we utilize at our sites based on the amount of food scraps that's coming in, as well as the capacity of space that we have to process the material. And so, yeah, thermophilic composting, essentially some of the things that are included are, it all starts with this lasagna layering of these basic 4 ingredients, which I'll expand a little bit more on in our second slide. Your thermophilic compost, it can heat up to as hot as 155 degrees. At our sites, we try to stay a little closer to like in between the 120 and 40. But yeah, your temperatures, they can get up pretty high. I've even seen them go up to like 160 and 70, which we keep our piles under that because we don't want to disturb or kill off any of the microbial life. And then, yeah, the heat is generated from the microbial activity in the core of the pile. Something that's common when we're talking with people about composting or starting a new compost site, people will say like, oh, I identified a really sunny location that I think is perfect for a compost pile. And yeah, just here to acknowledge and share that the actual heat is not coming from any of the surrounding things in that environment, like the sun. It's actually coming from the microbes working together, and their metabolism is actually what's heating the pile. And as far as like the fastest you can go from start to finish, mind you, yeah, people may have like say different things about this, and it really depends on like, you know, what you're looking at under the microscopic level and what you're looking for when it comes to finished compost. But what we've seen fastest from start to finish is like 3 to 5 months on average. And that's, of course, with us following our best management practices, as well as having like a significant mass involved in that, which we'll talk a little bit more about, like why that's important. And then vermicomposting, worm compost. So yeah, this is essentially, it's definitely a cooler, it doesn't heat up as hot. There's actually, we have compost thermometers, and at the sites where we have worm bins, we have, to make sure we're keeping it under around like, is it 90 degrees, Gina, for worms? I can't remember exactly, but I know that they don't like the heat. Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, I see. Oh, 60 to 80 AC here. Okay, cool. Extremely high in plant nutrients. I've heard people say that it's like 10 times higher in like the nitrogen and stuff like that than your standard finished compost. And what's cool about vermicomposting is it can be done indoors and in small spaces. Awesome. Cool. And then as far as like the 4 ingredients of compost, again, many different styles of composting. But as far as like when we just think about it in, kind of simplistic terms, is the 4 main ingredients are going to be your nitrogen, which is coming from your food scraps, carbon, which is coming from your browns, a mix of mulch, leaves, sticks, stems, tree bark, newspaper, cardboard, and then water and oxygen. And yeah, something that we always say is like compost piles are extremely forgiving, and the 4 ingredients are also the 4 solutions. And I know Gina will share a little bit more about this down the line when we talk a little bit more about like potential troubleshooting and stuff. But yeah, it's like if you walk up to your compost pile and it smells, there's an imbalance. It's like you're maybe a little higher on carbon and need to add nitrogen, or maybe you need to aerate your pile by turning it and adding oxygen to let things breathe and open up a little bit. I've also seen where people are like, hey, nothing's happening to my compost. Like I've been putting my food scraps there, covering them with leaves, nothing's happening. A quick solution out of the 4 ingredients, I'd be like, hey, maybe you don't have enough material yet and enough mass for your pile to heat up. And maybe it's a little dry and you should water it and aerate, just to kind of create more paths for microbes and insects and stuff to kind of flow through the pile. But yeah, 4 ingredients are always the 4 solutions, and this is just kind of like the basic of how we talk about those ingredients.
And just to jump in and add real quick,
Yes.
I think like we talk so often, it's focused on the food scraps and the carbon, the mulch, which obviously are both very important, but equally as important is that water and oxygen. And like Anjali was sharing, just like you and I, microbes need water and oxygen to thrive. So, you might have heard about like compost turning. That's why we turn the pile to encourage oxygen into the pile. So I just wanted to highlight that these 2, I feel like always get, they're at the bottom of the list, but I just wanted to reiterate. I feel like those are the 2 things that a lot of those issues might come from too. So thanks.
100%. 100%. So true. And then the last thing too that just came to mind is in a previous workshop, I heard a compost manager say like, we need to add a 5th ingredient, like love and care, just like a little effort, and I'm like, yeah, I agree. Okay, cool. When it comes to building your compost pile, all right, when it comes to building your compost pile, we use the lasagna style method, which essentially is like browns, greens, browns, greens, browns, greens, literally a layer. And I see it says equal parts carbon to nitrogen. So yeah, at minimum, you want to be covering your amount of food scraps with the exact same amount of carbon. I've seen people do a 2-to-1 ratio as well, just to really keep down on like gnats and flies. But yeah, carbon is really going to be your mulch. That's going to be like it's kind of safe space for keeping down odors, flies, gnats. So definitely, if you like, put more carbon than less. And then as far as the next talking point here is, it talks about like starting with browns on the bottom, and then water, and then greens, and repeat all the way to the top. Always super important to start your compost base with a nice thick layer of browns. It creates a cool like kind of biofilter that will help like absorb the leachate that may kind of seep through as you're building your pile. And then it's super important to water those browns because I mean they're extremely, extremely dry. We live in LA, it's dry. And then you're going to add your food scraps, and then like it says, you're going to continue to repeat. Awesome. And I'll pass it over to you, Gina, to speak a little bit more about like microbial activity at the bacteria and fungal level.
Yes, awesome. So we like to say, we are the facilitators of the compost pile, but it's really the microorganisms that are doing all the work. We can create the space so that they will come. And so just kind of briefly going over this, kind of the two main, when you hear people talk about microorganisms in compost piles, there are millions. And I think in 1 gram of, active thermophilic compost, I think there's like thousands of species, not even individuals, but thousands of species of microorganisms, which is amazing. And there's so much that actually, scientists don't know about microorganisms. So it's really fascinating. But for the most part of those microorganisms that you'll find in the compost pile, it's most commonly bacteria and fungi. Bacteria are more active during kind of the hotter phases of compost, which we'll go into later. And they do sort of the bulk of breaking down like sugars and carbohydrates. So kind of just think like the most easy to eat material, like a really wet watermelon, something that microbe can eat really easily. The fungi, on the other hand, they typically come later in the compost process. There's absolutely fungi existing in the thermophilic super hot phase. But typically fungi like cooler temperatures. So usually they increase as the compost gets cooler and decomposition slows down. And the fungi are really responsible for eating the woody pieces. So all those like big chunky pieces of your mulch, that is going to get broken down by the fungi kind of at the very end. So bacteria and fungi, they both play super important roles. Bringing it back to they're the ones that are doing all the work and they're the ones that we're taking care of with the water and the food. So yeah, just reminding ourselves that microorganisms are what makes the pile hot, what makes it decompose, and these different bacteria and fungi are specialized in decomposition, so they know how to do it. And so just kind of coming into a little bit deeper into the different stages of the composting process. So Anjali explained to us kind of just a few like different, what kind of characterizes thermophilic hot composting. It's hot, you're layering your 4 ingredients, takes about 4 to 3 to 6 months. But within that, period, there are multiple stages of compost. And so this little bell curve kind of just gives us an idea of these kind of 3 key phases. When we put the materials together, this is when I always use the baking metaphor. So like the mesophilic phase is kind of when we're building our layers. It's like our mixing bowl. We're putting those materials together. Remember, right place, right things in the right conditions, right? So we're putting all those materials into the right conditions. As we pull those materials together, we already are creating the conditions for decomposition. And so some of those microorganisms start to do their thing, they're eating, they're excreting, they're getting the pile hot, and they're actually setting the stage for higher temperatures and for more heat-loving bacteria to kind of emerge and really do the bulk of the decomposition. So as those temperatures increase, this kind of peak of our curve in the thermophilic phase is when the majority of the food scraps are being broken down. This kind of is where we reach that up to 155 degrees, but our sweet spot is kind of like 131. And then those temperatures drop as there becomes, less food to eat. Think about a buffet or, all the food's gone, everybody leaves. There's nothing else to do. So all those microbes kind of become dormant when there's nothing else to eat, and they start to enter this maturation phase. And this maturation phase is really important because remember when we were talking about, the thousands, millions of microorganisms in your hot composting, your really active compost phase, you don't want to add that to the garden. So you want to give at least a month for that pile to sit, reduce in temperature, come into ambient degrees. So, in LA, that's like 80, 90 degrees. And that's kind of when our pile is ready to sift and ready to use and add to the garden. So all these 3 phases equally as important. One of the things that this is prompting me to remind, and Anjali mentioned, is that in order to see these types of temperatures, it is relative to the volume of the pile. And so we're going to go over later in the presentation about different at-home composting systems. And I just want to flag right here that there are some backyard systems that will not get this hot. So you might be sitting there thinking like, I've been composting and I've never seen this much steam. There could be a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that if it's not 3 by 3 by 3, it just won't reach the kind of critical mass, the volume to get to those temperatures. So this is a photo at actually Occidental College with some of our student volunteers, and you can see how steamy this pile is. This will most likely happen in larger systems, but this is like goals, right?
Definitely.
And then just real quick, you guys are here at the compost workshops. You probably already know all the benefits of compost, but just a reminder, compost holds water in the soil. I think maybe Anjali, you can correct me, but I think it's like 10 to 20 times weight in water. And you can see this visually when you kind of water and activate compost. It's like a sponge.
Yeah. Gina, one of the things that I always like to do when I'm in person at a workshop is I like to take finished compost and pour gallons of water onto it, and then have people dig to the bottom to see how insane like compost water holding capacity is. And I always make that correlation of like, hey, if you've ever watered a plant at your house or in your garden and water just seeps through and rushes like through the holes in the bottom, it's because you don't have enough organic matter or soil structure for your like soil to hold on to the water. So like another just kind of visual and understanding of like the importance of compost and how it really holds on to moisture.
So true. I'm so glad you shared that. Yeah, that's so true. And I think even especially in our environment, like if you guys have, planted your tomatoes yet and all that, or if you're planting too soon, I always notice, if we have bare soil, that water dries out so quickly and we have to water every day. So having compost in your soil really helps to hold on to the water and saves us, water from using it. Compost also increases soil fertility, just like Anjali's been sharing about the soil food web and how when organic matter is in the soil, we create, more basically biodiversity, and that increases the soil's capacity to suppress diseases. So you can think of it just like your immune system, right? We hear a lot these days about like your gut flora. The more diversity you have, the better you're, going to be able to fight off different, viruses and all that. So compost and soil is the same way. It also builds soil microbial communities, like we've been saying, and eliminates the need for synthetic fertilizers. So both on a chemical and not wanting to add pollutants into our environment, but also not having to go out and buy stuff, having it all at your home for you, ready. So we're going to transition now. We're going to talk about, we kind of went over the basics, the fundamentals. We'll answer any questions that came up at the end. And we're going to move now into talking about how to get started. So I'm going to pass it off to Anjali to share all the different ways you can compost with us, with LA Compost, or you can compost at home.
Awesome. Sounds good. So some community composting options are through our LA Compost community and co-op hubs, which I mentioned earlier. You can find out more information about those on our Start Composting page at lacompost.org. And then something else that's really cool about all of our community sites is that all compost that's made at community hubs stays within that community. We don't distribute it or disperse it more than a 5 to 7 mile radius to surrounding community members who have participated in dropping off their food scraps. And then a large portion of it actually stays on site with that partner that we have, whether it's a community garden or a library that has a beautiful green space or whatever that may be. Cool, next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. Other community composting options are through our farmers market and contact-free drop-off locations. Yeah, this is a super awesome, just like quick, easy, show up, bring your food scraps. We have locations at farmers markets as well as a location in partnership with the Elysian Valley Community Garden. And all of this material is actually processed at our regional site. So like the slide that Gina shared with like the beautiful compost windrows decomposing and doing their thing. That's what our regional sites look like. So it's being taken to a local space and being composted in that way. And then as far as just, more drop-off opportunities for you guys, specifically for farmers markets. We're really expanding in farmers markets significantly between now and 2023. So currently we're in Highland Park, Atwater, Silver Lake, and we will be opening at Wellington as well as a state historic park, I believe by like sometime in May. So yeah, exciting. Cool. And then composting at home. If you have time, if you have space, if you have interest, there are so many ways that you can compost at home. Before I pass it over to Gina to like really deep dive into the different composting systems, I just want to leave like a word of encouragement. Like the compost pile, we always say is like extremely forgiving and you can't mess it up. Also, really what's most important is just for you to identify and decide like how much time you want to that you have available for composting, which really from there is like you just backwards plan to make it work with your schedule. Your compost pile can be as much work or as little work. I mean, you can look at it like once a month if that's like the kind of time you have, or you can turn your pile like once a week. So I just, I want to just leave you guys with the words of encouragement. Someone once told me, they said, you must decide first. So just decide like how much effort and time you have to put into this composting movement, and then kind of backwards plan from there.
Awesome.
But yeah, go ahead, Gina.
Yeah,
take us away.
Thanks, Angelia. That was my cue. Yeah, I love what you just shared, and it's so true. You know, LA Compost has, you know, the two offerings that we shared about community hubs and about farmers market. And those are really aimed towards folks who live in apartments, for people who don't have the time, don't have the space. And that's not to say that everybody can participate, of course. And so it really is all about what you're able to do. We want to equip and empower people to divert their food waste if that's their goal. And if your goal really is to connect a little deeper, kind of be a part of that process, be more hands-on, then composting at home or even just coming out to volunteer with us is great. So yes, I agree. All of the above. We want to, all of them are important, whichever one you choose to do and however you choose to participate in the composting movement. So when we talk about composting at home, we break it down into three categories. Choose your type of system. We'll talk a little bit about materials and bringing that to your home and how you'll do that. And then we'll go over just some of our frequently asked questions and tips. So there are so many different types of composting systems available these days. It feels like there's a new kind all the time, but we are going to cover just sort of the main ones that we both have experience with and some that have kind of been around for a long time and we're familiar with. So when you're choosing an at-home compost system, kind of the key considerations are time, effort, and cost. So all of these different systems are varying in amount of money that you're going to have to spend on it, the amount of time that you kind of need to dedicate, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. And then the amount of effort. So how much actual physical movement are you going to have to do to be able to maintain this system? So I'm just going to kind of briefly go over these, and feel free to throw any questions in the chat about any of the specific systems or your experience. So all of these systems, with the exception of worm bins, use lasagna layering. So that process that Anjali walked us through earlier about layering your browns, your greens, your water, browns, greens, etc. That's kind of going to be the same method. So you can keep that in mind as you're thinking about what system might work for you. You're going to need to do that layering method. So this one, the plastic bin, this is a really commonly available ones at city and county workshops. Back pre-pandemic, they used to do those more often, but you can always just look up your city or your county and see if they have a composting program available. Typically, they're at a highly discounted price. So this just tends to be one of the more common and accessible methods. This works. It's great for residential use if you have some space in your backyard. Of course, it's plastic, so that's something that you can consider if that's something that you want in your life, or if you don't. But this, again, is going to use your lasagna layering. I have seen these systems get really steamy and hot. I think some just kind of general pros and cons. They are definitely affordable, but you definitely need some space. And this is going to require you getting out there with your pitchfork and aerating it. I will go over that a little bit later, just at the end of this slide. So wire bins, these are kind of like the plastic bin, but a very affordable version. All you have to do is buy a roll of hardware cloth, And you basically create a square or a circle or whatever shape you want. And you're gonna fasten it together and then do the same layering process. They can dry out easily just because there's so much exposure on the edge. So you do want to kind of water this one more. This is going to be a system that I think one of the benefits is that you can make multiple of them because they're so inexpensive. You can have a few at different stages. So that can be just kind of a fun way to increase your capacity. Our tumbler, this one we get asked about a lot and a lot of people use this one. This is, I would say, the probably more expensive side, but lowest effort. All you have to do is, once every couple weeks, literally just turn the bin and that's it. I think most people could handle that. And
Gina,
yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the time frame of decomposition with tumblers and
yes,
the importance of having, if you're going to get a tumbler, it has to have 2 chambers?
Yes, thank you, Anjali. I was going to get into that totally.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and then cool. So yeah, tumbler, a little bit more expensive up front, but it's easier. I will say with tumblers, remember we mentioned the volume, 3 by 3 by 3. Since the tumbler is much smaller than that, it does not get hot. It can get warm, but it does not get steamy, and it doesn't usually get that hot. For that reason, you don't ever want to put weed seeds. You don't ever want to put diseased or damaged plants because those temperatures are not going to get hot enough to kill those viruses or pathogens. And yeah, this one typically takes about 9 months to process. So while we're here, we'll just kind of go over all of those 3 systems that we just kind of went over are one chamber. And so when you have one chamber and you're doing a continuous add method, you can imagine you're not building those layers all at once. You may be adding, a couple banana peels here, put some mulch on top, whatever. It's a much slower process. You can imagine one household. Not only will that take quite a bit of time to fully fill up, you're going to have compost at different levels of decomposition. Now, these plastic bins are always created with a little door so you can kind of lift it up and see what the bottom looks like. Because again, the bottom has been in there for longer, so it's going to be more decomposed than the material all the way at the top that you just added yesterday. So with the plastic bins, you can open up that door and kind of see and maybe harvest it. With the wire bins, you can usually see it visually. And with the tumblers, you sort of have to dig in there and figure out. The one thing that I want to note and that Anjali was reminding us to say is that with these tumblers, they do come in 2 chamber systems. So we recommend filling up one chamber fully, letting that decompose, and then begin adding to the other bin. That makes it so that your compost is relatively at the same stage. You're not continuously adding, and that way it, will never be finished. My kind of, yeah. I was going to do another baking metaphor, but I'll hold off today. The other thing that I want to say about the plastic and wire bins is since there only is one chamber, you're going to have material at different decomposition phases. What I've seen people do with the wire bins is have multiple ones. You can fill one up and then let it decompose, water it, aerate it, and then move on to another one. So just keep that in mind. If that's not clear and you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. And so these wooden and pallet bins, these are multi-chambered, okay? So you can imagine you can fill it up, it's at one stage, and then when it gets filled, you move it over, and that compost is kind of at your hot cooking thermophilic, whereas the other bin is where you're adding raw materials. This is better for community spaces. This at our hub serves like anywhere from 50 to 70 plus families. So obviously if you're composting just with your family, this would be larger capacity than you need. But we also have seen people like set up a 3 bin in their backyard and do composting collection for their whole neighborhood. So the sky's the limit if you want to compost in large amounts, but you don't eat that much food. Covered piles are also like windrows, what we mentioned before. These are kind of just big piles that we do lasagna layering. They do get really hot because the volume is quite high. This is one of your cheaper option, the cheapest option, because you really don't need anything except your materials and maybe a tarp. But this is the most labor intensive process. So just like we were talking about before, the importance of oxygen in our pile, with all of these systems, we have to aerate them. So with these kind of three, the one chamber systems, you can literally just get a pitchfork or a garden fork or a shovel, even like a stick, once every week we recommend, and just make sure that there's air spaces. Again, bringing it back to, we want to facilitate aerobic decomposition, which is going to be fast, efficient, and no odors, versus anaerobic decomposition, which is slow, stinky. And that's kind of that quintessential, when people say, my compost smells, it's because it's gone anaerobic. And frankly, it's because it just hasn't been managed to kind of our best practices. So all of these systems, just a quick review, they all have their pros and cons. You'll do lasagna laying for all of them, and you'll need to aerate in some way with all of them. Feel free to drop any questions about that in the chat. One more thing is Bokashi. LA Compost doesn't really focus on this method of composting, but we do have some amazing partners that do. Bokashi essentially is a kind of fermentation of your food scraps through a microorganism and bacteria, yeast. And Bokashi, you can literally compost anything like you see in these photos. You can compost meat, fish bones, meat, bones, anything. If you want to learn more, and this is something that's intriguing, you can check out Sustainable Little Tokyo. They're our partners, and they do amazing work to share the educational and awesome values of Bokashi.
Nice.
Right. Cool.
Is this me? Awesome. Okay,
yes,
perfect.
I've been talking for long enough. It's your turn, Anjali.
Awesome. That was great, Gina. Yeah, I love it. Okay, cool. Tips for composting at home. Yeah, decide first. Find out what system works for you. Yeah, find out what system works for you. Other tips that we always share with people is freeze your food scraps. It's often that there's these like countertop bins that are being heavily marketed of like, hey, store your food scraps here on the counter and let it sit for a couple days, and then potentially have like sludge and flies and gnats and smells and decomposition happening on your countertop. We suggest freezing those food scraps for two reasons. One, it makes for a more pleasant experience for the person who is engaging with the food scraps because they're frozen, they're hard, just also kind of just like out of sight. We can suggest like using either a reusable bowl, or I've seen people, and I do this, is like the brown paper bag. So you don't see, it's like you can just drop it off and then just like rip up your brown paper bag and throw everything in the compost pile. Another reason why it's so great to freeze your food scraps is because when you freeze anything, the cellular walls burst, and it makes it actually easier for the microbes and insects to fully decompose and start decomposing. It's almost like the decomposition has already started once the food scraps have defrosted. So we love freeze your food scraps. It'll just,
yes. And just because I'm thinking about different backyard composting systems, I just want to add while we're here at the freezing.
Yes.
This is another thing I recommend when people compost at home. Instead of having to kind of go outside and drop your food in your, bin every single time you eat, I always recommend just kind of chopping up your food scraps, putting in the freezer, and then you can make it like an every 2-week thing where you just take out the compost. This also helps to facilitate this kind of batch composting so that your compost is not in like, a huge time frame. You can do it sort of more in batch system. So I just wanted to.
Yes. And it's true, when you're doing things in batches, it's more common that your pile is going to get to a higher temperature faster. It's going to be easier for you to balance your pile. You'll probably maybe water a little less because you're not putting as much grounds. I don't know. It's just kind of a easier way to kind of fall into best management practices, is doing the batch composting style. Thanks, Gina, for that. Find support. Most things are better with help. This kind of goes back to that aerial snapshot of our human network, and then comparing that to the soil food web. A lot of the most beautiful things that happen do not happen in isolation. And so engage with your family and friends and encourage them to support, and just encourage it to be like a learning together kind of compost journey for you guys. Awesome. And then using compost in your garden and at home. A few different ways that you can use compost is you can add a handful to houseplants to add nutrients. Of course, utilize it in your garden by kind of sprinkling some on the top, and you can kind of scratch it into the surface and then do a nice deep watering. You can also do it if you're making like a soil mix for new seedlings that you're going to be making. Something else that here's like compost tea. It's a really great way to maximize a small amount of compost, because you can brew something that's high with kind of like this microbial activity, put that on your plant, and then it disperses itself, and then you can also still use that finished compost that you used to make the compost tea. I've also seen people take the compost tea and use it as like a foliage spray for like the tropical plants, the big beautiful leaf house plants that some of us like. So yeah, those are just kind of like some of the ways that you can use compost. Something else too that comes to mind is utilizing the sifted overs, like the leftover overs. But yeah, so like we use obviously a large amount of mulch and browns in our compost piles. And most people, when they think of finished compost, they think of that really kind of like grainy, like it looks like soil, you know? But we get to that by screening it through a sifter. And then we have these large chunks of like inoculated wood chips that are left over. And so that's another way to utilize compost, just in a different form.
Awesome.
Great.
Yes. Thanks for adding that about overs. It's so true.
Yeah.
Nothing in nature goes to waste, right? And so we have to kind of figure out how to mimic that and use everything as much as we can.
Waste is a human-made concept. 100%.
Boom. Good one, Anjali. All right. So we just added a couple tips for composting. These are some of the most frequently asked questions. And actually, I think Anjali went over a lot of these earlier, but we'll just do a quick review. Why does it smell? Usually it means it's gone anaerobic. Add browns, open up to increase airflow. So I feel like we went over this, and I think just bringing it back to what Anjali said in one of the first slides, all of those 4 main ingredients, food scraps, browns, mulch, and oxygen and water, those are the 4 solutions. So if you're noticing a smell, we kind of always recommend just adding more browns. The browns kind of soak up some of those odors. They help to filter it. And then if you also think it might just be dense, definitely go in with your pitchfork, open it up, and increase that airflow. So there you go. We had a problem. It's solved with browns and with oxygen. My pile's not heating up. Heat's relative to mass. Try building a large pile at once instead of small amounts. We kind of went over this. Something else that you can do, and I believe Anjali mentioned this, if it's not heating up, is just add some water, or maybe you have a little bit too much brown, so you might want to incorporate more food scraps. When is compost ready? Finished compost should smell just like soil, kind of like that classic earthy smell. And it should be ambient temperature. So again, about 80, maybe in the summer 90, but 80 degrees is kind of our sweet spot. You obviously should not see any broken down food or any food, and it might be chunky, and you can always sift it. And then again, like we mentioned, use those browns, the chunky stuff, and just add it as mulch into your garden. So getting involved, we have many different opportunities. One of the best ways to get involved is volunteer. I want to say we have an event almost every day of the week in a different part of Los Angeles. So check out lacompost.org/volunteer, and you will learn so much by just doing. Engage your company. So we do offer webinars, lunch and learns, private volunteer events. So if you work for a group and you think, I want, my team or my company to come out and, have a fun experience getting dirty and learning about stuff, definitely reach out to us. And then donations. This is our shameless plug. We're a nonprofit. We can always, use donations to expand our work, increase access, and continue to carry out our mission. So now have some time. Did you guys want, Elena or Anjali, do we want to add anything to the Get Involved page? Because you two also are our gurus and how to get involved. So I'll keep this up for now.
Yeah, I think volunteering is the best way to not only support the work of LA Compost, but also really learn and see everything happen that has been covered in this presentation firsthand. So we always recommend that if you are looking to grow your compost efforts. So I think that's a great one. But yeah, if you have any requests regarding, workshops for your own community, again, lunch and learns, private volunteer events, I'll go ahead and leave my email in the chat, and you're welcome to contact me regarding that. So I think now is a great time to transition over to our Q&A, if that's good with our facilitators. We have a couple amazing questions ready to go for y'all.
Yeah.
We're ready.
Browns. Yeah.
I believe the first question is from our friend Robin, and it is, how often should we water our compost piles?
Do you want to answer that one or which?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I mentioned at one point, typically people water less than we should. So that's always something to keep in mind. Typically, it should be what they say, 55% moisture, which is abstract. So we'll bring it down to reality. It should be like a wrung out sponge. So if you kind of imagine when you squeeze a wrung out sponge, there's no more water coming through your fingers. It's moist, but it's not muddy. Depending on what system, the watering is going to change. So I would just say keep it at that level. And definitely if you have, a 3-bin or an open pile, definitely give it some water weekly. And that can just be a, 5-minute spritz while you're aerating it.
And
Robin, anything else to add?
A quick follow-up just from Robin again. Should we still be watering during the maturation stage?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Just like I mentioned before, the fungi are really dominant in that stage, and they need water. So in order to encourage that fungal activity and growth, definitely keep it watered. Yeah.
Great.
Again, just kind of always like the wrung out sponge, always moist. You never want like a big dry pile. Even this photo I'm looking at, it looks moist.
Great example.
Use that as your guide.
Another question, what if your household produces more green waste than brown waste for lasagna layering?
Yeah. I can take a shot at answering that one, Gina.
Yes.
Kind of popcorn back and forth. Yeah, my suggestion would be to identify, well, I would have two questions. First, I would ask if you have space at your home to receive a mulch delivery. In that case, I would go with a local tree trimmer or someone like Chip Drop. Mind you, they are bringing mulch in the cubic yard form, but it's a really great way to keep green waste out of landfill. And it's an awesome way to support small businesses who are paying dumping fees when they take this material to landfill. So that would be my first question. Second would be, yeah, look around your neighborhood, collect leaves. Check out LA Sanitation's website. They have different mulch piles around the city that you can check out. And yeah, those would be my two. It's just like getting creative with sourcing your browns depending on the space that you have. Gina, you got other stuff to add?
No, I think you covered it. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we had one other question about that. So I think that, what is it?
Okay.
Feeds two birds with one hand.
One hand. Oh, also I have a question. Gina, this is yeah, feeding two birds with one hand. But yeah, Gina, just thinking about browns, because I know a form of browns that we don't think of often, and sometimes it takes a little bit more time to like break these things up before you add them in the pile. Just thinking how the question was phrased of like, I'm making more greens than I am making browns at my house. What about like paper towel rolls and like, the toilet paper rolls and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So cardboard, newspaper, those sort of unbleached paper products absolutely
Awesome.
can be used with browns. I do want to say that you still want to have some of those leafy, mulchy
100%.
materials. It's always good to have a diversity. I will just say, though, this is one of the biggest questions we get in terms of backyarding, composting in your backyard. And so I think just like Anjali said, be creative. Look in your backyard. Maybe you did a big, pruning job and you could chop up some, pieces. I always say no bigger than the size of your hand. And yeah, maybe, be creative, I think is really the solution, because there are options through the city, maybe in your own backyard, maybe in your neighbor, or maybe you get a big mulch pile that you can kind of share with neighbors and they can use it as well.
Also just thinking of like supporting small businesses and community members. Like I've known people who have seen like a gardener who works in their neighborhood, like, you know, two dudes who roll up on a pickup truck and they're blowing leaves and they're taking them with them. And they're like, hey, can I have your leaves? You know, because they're dumping them somewhere. So yeah, that could be another option.
Great point. I have a neighbor actually that will rake their leaves and bring them to me because they know that I want leaves. So make those connections, get your neighborhood leaf connections going.
Okay.
All right.
I want to move us on to another question. Question from our friend Jazz about if compost needs to be uncovered. Does the compost need to be kept uncovered? Was their exact question.
Yeah, so I think what that question means is, does there need to be a
Can it be a freestanding pile kind of thing?
Like, should there be a tarp or a cover? I think if you want to clarify in the chat if I answer this wrong, but based on what I think you mean, it should always be covered. If you don't have a tarp, if you don't have, you know, like a compost fabric, you just want to cover it with browns always. You never want to be able to see food scraps ever. So 2 to 3 layers on the top, if that's what it takes to fully cover, really cover that pile, and that's going to prevent not like so many issues or potential issues. So if that was not your question, maybe you can rephrase it if I answered that incorrectly, but you definitely want to have it covered with mulch. It doesn't like and then some of the plastic systems have covers and you can absolutely use those.
Okay, we also had a question around wanting to know more about the vermicomposting systems, composting with worms. So I know that's like a whole other topic to itself. So maybe like some key pointers or takeaways and or some places this individual and others who are interested can find more resources on vermicomposting.
I did see someone have a question in the chat saying like, how do I keep my worms cool or something like that earlier. And yeah, the first resource that comes to mind is this amazing woman-owned business out of San Francisco, led by this woman named Courtney. The business is called Common Compost. I've never met someone who knows so much about worms and is so like just fascinated with them. And she has shared some really cool tips with me. Like in the summer, we have a couple worm bins in the San Fernando Valley. It's super hot there. And some of the things that we do for our worm bins is we take like frozen water bottles and we put them in the corners. And we'll notice like the worms will kind of migrate and kind of stay further from the center and closer to the edges. But yeah, that's Common Compost is one of the first resources that comes to mind. Also, just thinking about Gina, this just popped into my brain. Bottoms Up Farm in Palmdale. Yeah. I mean, also someone else who is just like very resourceful and it's always like super open to giving tours and sharing, you know, creative ways of working with worms.
Okay. There's quite a few other questions rolling through. I want to bring up this one about compost tea. I think it's important. So this question says, I noticed the compost tea bit. How do you collect it? Does it expire and does it need to be aerated?
Yeah, so we have a recipe for compost tea that Elena's on our website, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that recipe is there. The question was, how do I collect it? So you can do it in a 5-gallon bucket. This is how I usually do it. I brew it straight into a 5-gallon bucket. And then once you're ready to, once you've brewed it we recommend 24 to 72 hours, aerating it regularly. Again, follow that recipe. Usually what I do is I just get like, I have like a little strainer. It's like a backyard sifter kind of thing. And I just strain it. So you can be creative and strain that compost straight into your watering can and then just use it immediately. Questions on does it expire? You definitely just want it to keep it aerated. And Anjali, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, okay, so I've seen, because there's like worm tea aerators like online, like for sale, which essentially just pushes air into the bucket, which is like what you said, Gina. You can literally stick your hand in there like twice a day and do that. I have seen if somebody tries to make compost tea and doesn't use it within like a 4-day period and it's covered with a lid, like I've seen it go anaerobic, you know, so just, just don't like, make sure. Yeah, I'd say try to use it within that 24 to 72 hour window. I mean, it's at its prime at that time, and just make sure, like Gina said, make sure it has oxygen able to get to it.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you, Anjali.
Okay, and then one question about tumblers.
Okay.
So Paola started their compost with the tumbler, and she says that it has 2 chambers in the tumbler. And if I think it's just that question of timing that often comes up with tumblers. If they fill out 1 chamber at a time until it's full, do you stop adding to it? Do you continue to add? This is a very common question.
Yeah. Okay. Anjali's not
Gina.
I mean,
Go ahead.
yeah. So I would definitely, I don't know. Yeah, you said there are 2 chambers. So what I would do, and this is what I have done in a tumbler with 2 chambers, freeze your food scraps, collect them for, I don't know, up to a month, depending on how much food scraps you create. That might be a lot for you. I don't know how much, fresh veggies you eat. Maybe it's just a couple weeks and you have a big bag. And I would not add, and I would try to not add into that chamber for more than a 3-month period. So in 3 months maximum, add your materials that have been frozen. That's going to fill up and then leave it. Don't add anything more to it, and then move on to the next chamber. 3 months is kind of a long time frame. Ideally, it would be like fill it up within a month, but we all have lives, and some weeks we don't cook that much. Who knows? But yeah, within like a few months, batch build that, fill that container, and then close it, water it. You can turn it, and then start adding raw material to the other one. Yeah. So at some point, cut off raw material and move on to the next one, depending on your time frame. Do you want to add anything, Anjali?
I mean, I'm just thinking of like, it's true, technically, once that first chamber is full, you really can't add anything. Otherwise, you're completely like slowing down the decomposition process. And I don't know, I just feel like with tumblers, you automatically run into a capacity issue because there's 12 months in a year and the tumbler is almost set up for you to be able to use it in a 6-month period, if you're filling like each chamber within a 3-month. So yeah, I just think of, I don't know, if you want to continue like having a space to add your material, if your both chambers get full, maybe just think in advance of like where an overflow could go, like a little windrow pile or something. Yeah.
Or a community compost drop-off.
Or a community or a farmer's market. That's great. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. Maybe your chamber's full, both chambers are full, and you're at your stop point. Maybe for a few months you go to the farmer's market drop off. So great idea. Love that.
All right. One last question I think we'll close out. It was around having some finished compost material that was troubling to sift. So it was kind of like chunky, and they ask, would smaller material and water be a reason why it wouldn't sift through? So is that something that typically happens with systems where you reach that finished phase and it's a little bit more like clumped together and you can't sift it as easily, or how do you amend that?
And when we say clumped, are we talking about like food scraps, like the avocado pits and mango pits, or are we talking like clumps of mulch?
I feel like it was all like just aggregated material, and I'm not sure if it was because we used like rice hulls and sawdust, like the smaller, finer materials versus, I mean, we did put leaves and wood chips in there, but I know there was the smaller material as well.
Yeah. Thanks for adding that. The first thing that did come to mind was that your brown materials are really small. And so one of the reasons why we love mulch is because it has so many different sizes and shapes and creates more air, like more pore spaces. And so that sort of lends to a more chunky, you said chunky, but I guess that's not the right word I want to use.
Like
kind
cakey,
of lends,
huh?
Yeah, exactly. Less cakey. It kind of lends to a more mixed, kind of like what this photo that I'm staring at. You can see there's a lot of different kind of chunks in there. I don't know if you showed Lynn your compost, but I feel like she would have had really good insight on that. But yeah, I would also think maybe if it was still that chunky, it might not have been totally finished. Yeah, Anjali, add what you're gonna say.
That was the first thing that I thought. Other than it just like things being extremely matted together from the sawdust and yeah, just using like the particles that are very small.
Yeah. So I would recommend diversifying your browns, getting some larger chunks that'll help to create a little bit more aeration and help make it, less clumpy at the end. And then I would honestly just kind of aerate it, those clumps, kind of sift it, move it, and then let it cure for a little bit and probably stop adding water for, I would say, maybe a month.
And it's, Gina, I think I've heard you say this before too, if you're using like sawdust and leaves predominantly, you're going to have a lot of caking because the leaves, they kind of just mush and
totally.
Yeah. And versus like the wood chips, like you mentioned, they create those little pockets for air and yeah.
So once you start composting more, you're going to become a mulch and leaf aficionado, and you're going to start looking at piles of leaves or mulch and saying like, oh yeah, that would make really good compost, or like, nah, I don't want that, too small. So.
Awesome. Well, for those of us that are still here, I want to give a big virtual round of applause to our facilitators for sharing all of that amazing information with us, and as well as for our attendees for being very attentive and asking amazing questions. Composting is done in a community, and this is what brings us life and joy. And this is what this is our bread and butter, soil and people. That's kind of our thing. So even though we're not together in person, I think it's great that we're able to all join this evening and receive this amazing information from these two. So big round of applause for that. Stay engaged with LA Compost. Our website is definitely your one-stop shop for all things events, volunteering, resources, and how to get in touch with us as well. So I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. And we hope to see you either around the compost pile, at a farmer's market, at another workshop, whatever it may be. So one big thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And thanks, Gina. You're amazing.
And
you too,
thank you, Anjali. You're amazing. Thank you, everybody. So glad you joined.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Hope to see you soon.
I'm going to stop there.